Chapter 3. Narco Kings. Burn City gangland motto: we catch and kill our own. They say the age of kings is dead. The age of rule where the throne, the seat of power, was passed on from one member of a ruling family to another. The age where wealth, power, prestige and privilege were in the hands of a prevailing household. An age that was the product of local agricultural activity. An age of long ago. However, if you observe power with a sharp eye, it is obvious that the age of kings is still upon us, but not as it existed way back then. No, today's kings are criminal, and they gain their crowns through merit, smarts, and psychopathic ambition. They carve out their kingdoms of vice and violence by harnessing and riding global networks. These networks are lightning quick, flexible, and have little in the way of restraint from the plotting nation state. Their networks are the product of a complex, technological, increasingly interconnected global age with its own kings, some of which are narco kings. One of these kings was the ageing Frankie O'Flynn, who was 20 minutes away from an attempt on his life. The latest bloody Melbourne underworld war had been staggering along for 8 years and had taken 20 lives so far, and it was wreaking havoc with Frankie's nerves and mind. Frankie sculled the rest of his whiskey at the restaurant table and told his wife he was heading outside for a cigarette. "I badly need a smoke," he said to himself after finishing a big dinner. The Brighton Baths restaurant was Frankie's favourite haunt these days. The 1930s Art Deco building on the beach in the elite suburb was within strolling distance of the criminal chief's house. As he walked out of the front doors of the eatery into a hot balmy night, the overweight O'Flynn already had a cigarette in his mouth ready to be lit. He stood to the right of the restaurant near Brighton Pier and tried to anticipate his enemy's next moves while lighting and then puffing away rapidly on his cigarette. Where, when, and who will they send? Who will stand with me? And more importantly, who's left? Frankie had plenty to ponder. With a hot easterly breeze blowing over his shoulders, Frankie finished his cigarette and threw it on the ground. After stomping out his cigarette butt on the concrete path, he looked out over the bay. He could see twinkling orange and white lights highlighting the northern and western suburbs. These burbs were home to a new breed of outlaw, not intimidated by big reputations and showing little respect for Melbourne gangster royalty, such as O'Flynn. Frankie was a member of gangland royalty thanks to his world-class arm robber father. O'Flynn himself had blooded his sword during the infamous waterfront wars on Melbourne's docks during the 60s, 70s and 80s. It was a power struggle to see who could control the powerful Painters and Dockers Union and its lucrative illegal rackets. Those battles took 40-odd lives. There was only one way to rise through the underworld, and that was to cripple bodies, end lives, build alliances and then break them. That's what Frankie had done, and done well, but in his 70s he'd had enough. Too many years filled with rage, fear and paranoia had taken their toll. It showed in the deep lines on his face. Everything was travelling so smoothly then, O'Flynn recollected bitterly as he gazed out across the bay and lit another cigarette. He was thinking about the peace and calm before the great party drugs boom. That criminal boom time was a double-edged sword. On one edge it brought an obscene amount of money. On the other, to earn and protect this money, you had to use violence, an obscene amount of violence. This illegal prosperity was driven by cashed-up youth who did not know anything else but how to party with pills and long lines of cocaine. Unwittingly, this social media megastar generation of playboys and playgirls bred a new brand of criminal. Young hoods from tough neighbourhoods started early as drug dealers, muscle and assassins for the more established crime factions in town. Then they went out on their own as a loose network, but always sending a percentage of their earnings up through the vertical food chain to criminal elders like Frankie, who lived in salubrious suburbs. "Are you ready to head home, Francis?" asked Mrs. O'Flynn as she walked up behind her husband. Deep in thought and already twitchy, the old crimp spun around quickly. "Jesus, are you trying to give me a heart attack or something?" Frankie said with one hand on his heart. As they dawdled over to his black Mercedes-Benz, which had been parked under a light in a handicap spot, Frankie placed his arm around his wife. With his free hand, he made sure the 9mm pistol tucked into the front of his strides and covered by his suit jacket was in place, ready for action. Before getting into his car, O'Flynn looked to his left toward the CBD. There, skyscrapers were going up everywhere, and enormous cranes dominated the skyline. Apartments and office space couldn't be built quick enough. Melbourne was booming. Some of the big investors in these developments were the new Narco kings, men making more money than their working class brains could ever imagine. They emerged from their outer suburban mansions at night and made their way south of the Yarra to backslap, air kiss and party with fellow modern gods from sport, entertainment, politics and business. These power brokers were also their best customers and business partners. No one had seen this type of decadence since the early 80s in Colombia, when Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel were shifting cocaine to the US by the ton. In O'Flynn's younger years, they never dared to dream of such power and riches. Now it's in the hands of those little shits, thought Frankie as he got into the driver's seat of his vehicle. Frankie started the Benz, then drove out of the restaurant car park. Seconds after driving down Beach Road, he indicated, then turned the Mercedes left into his street. As the black sedan cruised down the street, O'Flynn remembered that during the initial surge of illicit drugs, all the big crime groups were happy to cooperate or stay out of each other's way and establish their own territory. Then three things happened. The first disturbance in gangland came when the Victorian Police Force decided to become part of the drug trade. Police officers had the idea that if they supplied drug-producing chemicals to criminal cartels through their informers, they could track the chemicals all the way to their intended targets. The operations were a great success, and a couple of leading players ended up in prison. However, after the big bust, suspicion and paranoia spread like cancer throughout the underworld. All gangsters, old and new, had no idea who was informing on whom. The second tremor was a natural consequence of egotistical men making enormous amounts of money. Greed. This faction was eyeing off that faction's business. This bloke wanted this bloke's business. The last wobble was the speed at which the young bloods surpassed their masters. They trafficked and produced quality product at a cheaper price than everybody else, and their marketing skills were second to none. These three ripples on the surface of the narcotics ocean built and built till they become a tidal wave of violence. Frankie pulled into his driveway, and the high automatic front gates of his Federation-era mansion swung open like welcoming arms. As the Mercedes-Benz rolled up the property's driveway, Frankie looked in his rear vision mirror to make sure an assassin hadn't run in as the gates were closing. Nothing, the old crook sighed. "Let me out here," ordered Mrs. O'Flynn. Frankie did as he was told and pulled the Mercedes up just short of the open garage. As the veteran gangster watched his partner remove her tired body from the vehicle, a giant muscular man dressed in black slipped from the shadows of the lush garden bed a few metres from the Benz. Lucky for Frankie, his street smarts hadn't deserted him. He looked to his right and saw a massive body starting to block out the limited light. He went for his pistol. From the cramped space of the Mercedes, O'Flynn got a shot away. In return came 10 rounds from a .45 caliber pistol at close range. As silence returned to the quiet street, the massive assassin opened the Benz's driver's side door, then leaned into the vehicle to check the victim's carotid pulse. Another legendary crim was on his way to gangster Valhalla. As Melbourne was abuzz with the murder of Frankie O'Flynn, frustration was building up inside Jason Farrelly as he trod water down the deep end of his local swimming pool. One-lap wonders and New Year resolutioners had infested the swimming lanes over the holiday period once again, so Farrelly had to wait a while to get a lane to himself. When an empty lane appeared, he pulled his goggles down over his eyes and duck-dived down to the bottom of the pool before swimming underwater to the spare lane. The weightlessness, silence and tranquility of the underwater swim was exhilarating and changed his mood to a good one. After 45 minutes of swimming along the black line in his lane, Farrelly had forgotten how many laps he'd done as something was on his mind. A couple of days ago, an old school friend had given him a call. His name was Tomasz Jankowski. Apparently Jankowski was one of those narco kings, if you believe what was rumoured and said about him. Tommy was also supposed to be chin deep in the current underworld battles that had lit up the Melbourne landscape like a napalm airstrike. Tommy and his friends and foes had captured the imagination of the public, for whom there is something cool about blokes who turn their backs on society and its rules and do their own thing their way. As Farrelly climbed out of the pool and went to collect his backpack, which was leaning against the wall nearby, he had a rough idea of why Tommy wanted to contact him. Once showered and changed, he passed through the sliding doors of the leisure centre and began crossing the car park on the way to his ute. Halfway to his vehicle, his mobile phone started ringing in the pocket of his shorts. The number on the screen of the phone was unknown. "Hello, who's this?" "It's me, bro." "Yeah, who are you?" Farrelly demanded. "It's Tommy Jankowski." Farrelly had forgotten to add Tommy as a contact on his phone. "Ah, the Polish kid we used to hang shit on at school." "Yeah, that's me, arsehole," Tommy answered. "I bet you're ringing me using one of your many dodgy SIM cards," Farrelly joked. This brought laughter from the other end of the line. "Listen, we have to catch up." "Why?" Can't say too much over the phone, but it'd be good to see ya and have a chat." They agreed on a time and place to meet. Farrelly was curious to know exactly what Tommy wanted, even though this get-together could draw attention to him from both sides of the law, which he didn't need. As he jumped into his car, he thought through Jankowski's past, as if he was reading Tommy's resume for future reference. He remembered that the young Jankowski had arrived on Australian shores from Poland at an early age, with his mum and dad. As it was for most migrants, their first home was a grubby high-rise flat in inner-city Melbourne. Then when Tommy's dad found work at the Ford factory in the outer northern suburbs, they packed up and moved out there. This was where he formed friendships with Farrelly and a few other lads. Secondary school was a great time for these young blokes, as they did very little study. Tommy did have a passion in his teens, and that was cycling. He spent many a long afternoon in the saddle doing road work. Thick in the thighs and backside, and much taller than his mates, Jankowski was a junior sprint champion and tore up the velodrome at every event he entered. At one stage, there was even talk of the Olympics. Unfortunately, the kid from Poland also had his troubles. Even in secondary school, he still found it hard to pronounce certain English words, and for this he was teased relentlessly. His boisterous, humorous nature and the fact that he was bigger than most meant he was signalled out by bullies and teachers who liked to make an example of him. Fighting after school became regular for Jankowski, as did detention. After Year 11, Farrelly and Tommy went their own ways, while the other boys of this tightly knit group stayed together. They married and had children and did not move from the same suburb. Meanwhile, due to their rumoured exploits, Farrelly and Jankowski became folk heroes to their old school buddies. Through contact with these friends, Tommy was aware of Farrelly's activities. Knowing this, as Farrelly drove out of the leisure centre's car park, he realised that Jankowski hadn't rung to reminisce. He probably required his services. The suburb where Jankowski and Farrelly had agreed to meet was Williamstown, which has some great views of the city skyline. This quiet inner western suburb, with its cafes and restaurants, sits on the bay and is moments away from the CBD, if you take the nearby Westgate Bridge. They had agreed to meet out on the end of a pier that runs out from the gardens of Williamstown's main thoroughfare. Half an hour before the 11 o'clock meeting, Farrelly parked his ute a street back from the main road. He then strolled up and down the main drag, checking out the scene like a tourist. Even though Farrelly had no connection to any of the current underworld troubles, he thought it was best to be prepared for anything. Therefore, He had a loaded 9mm pistol nestled in the newspaper, folded up in his left hand. Not long after he took a seat on a bench in the shaded gardens, Farrelly observed two shiny black Range Rovers parked with their noses out, outside a restaurant that served French crepes. The brand spanking new vehicles had unimpeded views of the pier. Inside them were restless men wearing designer sunglasses, tracksuits and runners. Farrelly gave himself a mental pat on the back for being cautious and vigilant. The next couple of minutes flew by as he sat in the gardens, watching the colourful men converse between cars. Sitting in the passenger side of one of the Rovers was Narco King, Tommy Jankowski. As Farrelly watched Tommy, he thought that the one outstanding thing Jankowski had in common with himself was that both never accepted what was expected of them. Being your average suburbanite wasn't good enough for these two. There were too many challenges and adventures to be had. After leaving school, Tommy had worked on the line at the Ford factory, side by side with his father. This only lasted a few months as the monotony on the line drove him crazy. While drifting from job to job, Jankowski partied every night and experimented with drugs to combat the directionless and disillusionment dominating his life. The use of illicit drugs brought him in contact with local criminals. Tommy was in his early 20s when he started working as a mule and manufacturer for a major drug dealer in the northern suburbs. During this period, Jankowski got arrested and was incarcerated for 18 months. You'd think this would have deterred him from continuing his criminal career, but the opposite was the case. In prison, he gained all the skills and knowledge needed to run a successful criminal empire from other inmates. After leaving prison, Tommy quickly became a wealthy, legitimate businessman. On paper, anyway. In the passenger seat of his Range Rover, Jankowski looked at his gold wristwatch, then turned to talk to a colleague in the back seat. "Let's get going." He turned back to look at the dark-haired, well-built man sitting relaxed in the park. "Our man's already here." As Tommy crossed the main road, dressed in a dark blue tracksuit, Farrelly noticed he had put on weight around the midriff, but was still muscular in the legs and thin in the upper body. Walking behind Tommy, dressed in a black and gold tracksuit, was what appeared to be an armoured van with arms and legs. The bloke was all muscle, no fat, weighed 150 kilos, and was tall. As the two gangsters crossed the road heading towards the pier, Jankowski gave Farrelly a cheeky wave. Farrelly smiled and got up off the bench. Tommy and his bodyguard waited near the entrance to the pier when they caught the eyes of a mum and dad playing with their kids. One of the kids ran up to the mountain man and asked him his name. "My name is Max," he answered with a thick Eastern European accent and a big grin on his face. "Are you a giant?" asked the boy, pointing a finger up at Max. "Of course I am." As the conversation between giant and child continued, Farrelly greeted and shook hands with Tommy. Max managed to watch all of this out of the corner of his eye as he kept the kid entertained. Tommy inspected his old buddy through his large gold-rimmed sunglasses. "Shit, you look fit, mate. What about you, Chief? You've put on a bit of beef." Jankowski put a hand on his paunch and gave it a pat and chuckled. This bit of banter was just polite, superficial cover for what they were thinking. In their teens, Tommy had been much stronger and bigger than Farrelly, but now the roles had been noticeably reversed. Before stepping onto the wharf, Jankowski motioned for Max to follow them. The big bloke then followed the former schoolmates at a distance. "What's with the block of flats following us? Don't you get enough attention? Or were you worried I might have taken one of those contracts out on you?" Farrelly asked the boss, squeezing the pistol inside the newspaper. "He's family. I can trust him." Farrelly didn't believe for a second that Max was family, or that Tommy trusted him. "They call him the Python. He squeezed a man to death in a nightclub in Warsaw one night," said Jankowski. Both men laughed. They had been around long enough to spot an urban myth when they heard one. "Good to see you anyway, Jace." Those were the first true words Tommy had spoken so far. They wandered up the wharf chatting about nothing and passed by the World War II Navy ship moored against the pier on the left. When they got to the end of the dock, Farrelly checked out the great view of the CBD slightly to his right. "So what did you want to speak to me about, Tommy?" "I heard what you did to those Aryan cunts. It was impressive. So I thought to myself, I need this bloke working for me," Jankowski replied, facing the city and chewing his fingernails. "Listen, I'm not interested in your line of work. No offence. It's not what you think. I need someone handy to escort cash for me, sort of like a security guard." The crime boss went on to explain that his property development companies often move large quantities of cash around the city. Why these companies were carting cash around, Farrelly was unsure, but he knew these cash runs had been robbed a couple of times recently. A lot of money had been stolen. "I can't have it going on anymore," Jankowski stated with a determined expression on his face while still facing the CBD. "Surely your own blokes can do the job?" Jankowski ignored the question and made Farrelly an offer. "I'll pay you $3,000 a week cash. There's bugger all involved, Jace." As Tommy chewed his fingers off, Farrelly thought over the offer. A short while later he spoke up. "I'll need plenty of money for expenses, and I'm not carrying anything but cash, understand?" "Whatever you want, bro," said the grinning Narco king. Even though Tommy had gotten into a few fights at school, he couldn't fight. So when he started off in his criminal journey, he learnt the importance of gathering hard, violent men around him to protect himself and his business interests. One of these men was Polish powerlifting champ Max Kowalka, who now had one eye on the shore and the other on Farrelly. After discussing a few more terms and conditions, Jankowski and Farrelly shook hands. Satisfied, the Narco king walked off as a fully laden container ship glided in from the right, almost blocking out the city skyline. As the two gangsters walked off the wharf, Farrelly stood watching them. As with a lot of things recently, Farrelly was unsure why he'd done the right thing by agreeing to work for the high-flying gangster. It was the money that had swayed him. Also, since the gunfight in Kelly country, he felt he was on a one-way highway with no turn-offs. One thing he was sure of, though, was that life was going to get a lot more interesting from here on in. The following morning, Farrelly went to a Toyota dealership. Without handing over any money, he picked up a brand new grey Toyota four-wheel drive wagon from a salesman Tommy had told Farrelly to ask for. After a nod and a wink, Farrelly pulled out of the dealership in a clean car that could not be traced to him or any criminal activity. While sitting at the first set of traffic lights he encountered, Farrelly paired his phone to the wagon's radio, then played the song 10 Crack Commandments by the Notorious B.I.G. He listened to this song as he drove down the road, and it reminded him of the rules of employment that he had agreed upon with Jankowski, which were as follows. Rule 1. Whenever there was money to be transported, he was to be called on his work mobile phone only. Rule 2. He would pick up a consignment from a designated address sometime during the day and not give a specific time for security purposes. The same applied on the other end of the delivery. Rule 3. No one was to know how much cash he was carrying. Rule 4. No one he encountered was to know his name and who he was. Rule 5. Farrelly carried cash only, no drugs, no weapons, no women, and no bodies alive or dead. Rule 6. He would be paid in cash at the end of each working week. If a payment was missed, it would mean war. At 08:30 the next morning, Farrelly received a phone call from Tommy. "Hey bro, how are ya? Ready to go?" Silence on the other end of the line gave the Narco king his answer. "Of course you are, mate." Buoyant because Farrelly would now be carting his cash, Jankowski gave him an address that he would go to in a couple of hours' time. Farrelly parked the grey four-wheel drive a couple of doors down from the house he was instructed to pick up from. He grabbed a black dive bag off the front passenger seat, got out of the vehicle and locked it. In his light grey suit and black sunglasses, he didn't quite fit into his surroundings. He wasn't told that he'd be picking up in suburbia. Accepting this small setback quickly, Farrelly threw the black bag over his left shoulder. In the long side pouch of the bag, he had a cut-down loaded semi-automatic shotgun. He could access the weapon through a slit he'd made in the pouch. Along with the shotgun, Farrelly was carrying a 9mm pistol holstered high on his right hip. The house he walked toward was like many other houses in the area. It was a square, double-storied, brown brick building with white concrete balustrades and banisters. It also had a high brick front fence. White concrete lions were sitting high on either side of the strong steel front gates. Farrelly stood outside the imposing entrance and studied the house. As he was doing this, the gate opened just enough for a bent-over elderly man in a grey cardigan to look at Farrelly. The old man put one hand behind his back. In response, Farrelly slid his hand into his bag and onto the pistol grip of the shotgun. With a raspy Italian accented voice, the ancient man asked, "Are you the new delivery man?" After a nod from Farrelly, the old bloke waved him inside. In the double garage of the house, Farrelly filled his bag with a large quantity of bundled up cash that was sitting on a workbench. Once loaded up, Farrelly left the house and headed to the drop-off point for the consignment. That was the CBD office of Stonebridge and Bradley Property Development. When he arrived in the CBD, Farrelly parked his Toyota in a dingy car park on Burke Street, then with a heavy black bag over his shoulder, walked 3 doors down to a building that housed the property development company. The building's foyer was narrow and cramped, so when Farrelly pushed open the stiff front door, he almost knocked over a woman who was about to pick up a box. "Whoops, sorry," Farrelly apologised as he held the door open. The beautiful brunette standing inside the door gave him a weak smile before continuing with what she was doing. After passing by her and checking her out, Farrelly made his way towards the lift, which was on its way down. As he waited, Farrelly adjusted the strap on the heavy bag as it was digging into his left shoulder. Once he was comfortable, he took a better look at the woman with the heavy box in her hands. She was statuesque, around 180 centimetres tall, and wore a black dress that accented her slim body and large breasts. When the lift arrived, the dark-haired beauty made her way over and entered it with Farrelly. Before the lift doors closed, they both went to push the button for the 6th floor. As the elevator shook and shuddered on its way up, a silent tension built between the two. Standing side by side, they checked each other out in their peripheral vision. "Maybe I should make conversation," Farrelly thought to himself. "Nah, fuck it. She looks too serious." The elevator arrived at the 6th floor. Farrelly allowed the brunette to exit the lift first, then stepped into a mid-century furnished waiting room that belied the building's ordinary exterior. The woman disappeared into an office on the left. Farrelly heard her drop the box on a hard surface. He stayed where he was, guessing she would be back any second. As she re-entered the room, the woman gave Farrelly a friendlier smile than the one she had given him downstairs. She pointed at him and asked with an Eastern European accent, "Are you the new delivery man?" Farrelly nodded. He watched her disappear into an office on the right, where he could hear a short conversation between her and a male. When she returned, she had a grin on her face. She motioned for Farrelly to follow her down a passage straight ahead. By the time he entered the hallway, Farrelly had the best view of the brunette's body, which was framed beautifully by her black dress. If there was a gunman waiting down there for him, Farrelly was dead. His mind was elsewhere. On all 4 walls of the storeroom at the end of the passage, there were shelves stacked with stationery. In the centre of the room was a large table. As she entered the room, the woman instructed Farrelly to place his bag on the table. He complied. The woman tied back her hair. As he took the cash from the bag, Farrelly watched the tall beauty take a money-counting machine off one of the shelves and place it on the table. "Oh, I'm Sophia, by the way." As Sophia leaned over the table and shook Farrelly's hand, he stared straight into her chocolate brown eyes, and when he thought it was safe, he peeked at her bountiful cleavage. After emptying his black bag, Farrelly said goodbye to Sophia, and he suspected she feigned being too busy to notice him leave. For the next few weeks, Farrelly picked up massive amounts of money from well-secured homes in the northern and western suburbs. He would drop off the cash to either offices of Stonebridge and Bradley or a couple of other businesses in the CBD. But by a long way, His favourite place to drop off money was where Sophia worked. He relished being in her presence and enjoyed strengthening the natural connection between them. After he completed his last job one Friday, Farrelly received a phone call on the mobile phone he used for his delivery business. "How's things going, bro?" inquired a cheery Jankowski. "Yeah, good. Yourself?" "Yeah, good. Hey, come around my joint tomorrow, Arvo. I want to have a word with you about something." "Again?" Tommy laughed at his friend's directness. "Yeah, nah, come around. We'll hang out and have a drink." When tomorrow afternoon arrived, Farrelly found himself in another western suburb on Port Phillip Bay. In this suburb, among average 3-bedroom brick homes overlooking the beach, were some grandiose new homes. One of these impressive mansions was owned by Tommy Jankowski. It was a white 3-storey monster fronted by a high wall. It also had underground parking. In shorts and a polo shirt, Farrelly waited outside the mansion. An unsmiling, tattooed-covered tough guy opened the mansion's front security gate for him. Once he was inside, the hoodlum went over him with a metal-detecting wand. After this security measure was complete, the tough guy pointed towards the large glass front doors of the mansion. Before Farrelly reached the wide steps, someone yelled out from the balcony above, "Here he is! Come upstairs, bro!" Farrelly passed through the front doors and climbed the spiral staircase. He halted halfway up to check out 3 stunning ladies in tiny bikinis who were sitting by the lap pool running alongside the house. He couldn't help but stop and stare at the women who were sipping on brightly coloured cocktails. "How good is this?" Tommy crowed from the 3rd floor. "I'm living the fucking dream, bro." "Yeah, no worries, Scarface. More like living a cliche if you ask me," Farrelly replied as he continued up the stairs. When he got to the top floor, he turned left and left again and headed out onto the balcony, which had a magnificent bay view. Jankowski stood there with his arms out wide. Farrelly froze for a second. It was as if he'd stepped out onto the set of a Hollywood gangster movie. The flash house, hot women by the pool, and no doubt European sports cars in the underground garage. Farrelly wondered in his own way whether Tommy was a free man as he believed, or had he just exchanged government and societal laws and norms for a parallel structured system that was governed by criminal codes and symbols, much of which were derived from popular entertainment. Farrelly sat down on one of the comfortable chairs on the balcony, and Jankowski went inside and got them each a vodka, lime and soda. When he returned, the Narco King grabbed himself a seat and they proceeded to talk sport. When there was a short break in conversation, Tommy asked Farrelly how his first few weeks went. "Yeah, good. No drama so far." "Be careful, mate. There's heaps of crazy cunts out there looking to get cashed up quick without doing the hard yards, if you know what I mean," Jankowski warned, biting his fingernails and bouncing his knee up and down. With a wry smile, Farrelly asked, "You're doing the hard yards, are you?" "Me? I'm a businessman, running a variety of vertically integrated, highly complex businesses. I could run fucking BHP, no worries," Tommy stated in jest. You had to agree, operating a large illegal network and legal businesses at the same time took talent and had to be a big challenge. "I'll give you that, mate," Farrelly remarked, raising his glass. After taking a sip of his drink, he continued with a chuckle. "Though BHP gives something back, unlike some of your enterprises." "Fucking BHP. They're the biggest criminals ever," Tommy replied in disgust. Farrelly laughed. "People think I'm an evil cunt, but I'm just like BHP or any other business. There's a demand, so I supply. People come to me, and I give them what they want. It's as simple as that," Tommy argued aggressively. He sculled his drink, then added, "Supply and demand, bro. It's as simple as that." "Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it," Farrelly noted with raised eyebrows. "Have a listen to you taking the high road. You're in the game now as well." "Yeah, but I'm just a security guard sorta, remember?" "Well, that's one way of looking at it," Jankowski retorted. Sure, Farrelly's comments could have prompted Jankowski's surliness, but it was more than that. Maybe it was the result of a build-up of frustration from the intense vilification from the media, or maybe it came from his conscience. Over the next couple of minutes, there was silence as both men drank their drinks and watched the water rhythmically flowing onto the beach below. After a few more vodkas and some laughs, the Narco King opened up about his troubles with established crime factions and how he was beating them. Tommy Jankowski hadn't established your run-of-the-mill crime organisation, structured like a pyramid, where profits flow up from the street thugs to a single boss. That was a system prone to failure due to the lack of reward and opportunity for the lower ranks. Instead, Jankowski had devised a horizontal two-layered operation system, which encouraged young career criminals to start up their own criminal cells. Tommy was on the top layer, then underneath him were the rest, but on an equal footing. Overnight, ambitious young hotshots flocked to the new system and were rewarded immediately. All that Jankowski asked was for a 15% take, which was a lot lower than anyone else asked for. He also required their loyalty to his organisation. In return, these criminal capitalists received a steady supply of narcotics, limited protection from the authorities, and the laundering of their profits. The beauty of the system was that the independent cells took all the risks. All Tommy had to do was count the money. Things were going so well for him that he now offered an interest-free start-up loan to anybody who wanted to join the organisation. So at this stage in the gangland war, he had more gunmen than any of his rivals. After Jankowski had divulged all this information, it was dark, and a cold breeze blew in off the bay, so the two men left the terrace and went inside. Sitting on the lounge in the vast upstairs area were the young ladies who had been loitering around the pool. They had changed into some casual gear. As Farrelly sat down between two blondes, Tommy announced that it was time to get into the champagne. A big night ensued. As the sun was rising the next morning, Farrelly woke up with a king-size headache in a king-size bed in a bedroom that overlooked the suburb. He felt terrible, but remembered with clarity what had transpired the night before, so he rolled over. Lying next to him was a cute blonde with large fake breasts, and an angel holding a human skull in each hand tattooed across her back. Farrelly gave her a gentle shake so she'd wake up. He was determined to enjoy what he could while he could. Mid-morning, Farrelly got out of bed and found Tommy, who was hungover and eating toasted sandwiches at his dining room table. His hoodlum mate sat opposite him, scrolling through social media posts on his phone. "Sit down, mate, have a feed." "Nah, just come to tell you thanks for last night." "Fucking good night, yeah?" "Yeah, it was a ripper," Farrelly agreed, before switching to a more serious issue. "Hey, just a friendly warning. I'd watch yourself sitting out there on that balcony," he cautioned. "Why is that, mate?" "Well, if I took a contract out on you, I'd park in one of those car spots over the road in a van and take you out with a rifle with a scope. It would be so easy from that distance." The Narco King went from hungover to sober in a split second. "Enjoy your day," Farrelly said as he left. Quote from Basil Henry Liddell Hart. "The shortest path between 2 points of warfare is the least expected. There is no one harder to combat than a psychopath, or someone who has nothing to lose and is willing to die no matter what." This was foremost in Farrelly's mind as he drove north along a freeway, followed by two young men in a blue 1980s V8 Holden sedan. Farrelly had noticed the sedan following him, always 2 or 3 cars back, not long after he'd picked up a consignment from a criminal in a western suburb. Either they were stupid or they thought Farrelly was stupid, or maybe they didn't care if their target knew they were there. This last theory was the one that had Farrelly worried. The young guns getting around the city these days were not scared of taking on the police, enemies, or in a lot of cases, their own mates. They had a couldn't give a fuck attitude that was not just bravado and cover up for all sorts of insecurities, but a genuine I don't care what happens to me outlook. For them, the future went as far as the next hour. This made them perfect employees for the likes of Jankowski, his allies and his enemies. These young men would do anything, were many and were also dispensable. After 20 minutes of this charade, Farrelly pulled off the freeway and made his way to a large shopping complex. He parked in an area of the car park that was well away from the shopping centre, where few cars were parked, and waited in his vehicle. A few seconds later, the V8 sedan drove by. The man in the passenger seat of the blue car glared at Farrelly through his large dark sunglasses. Farrelly watched as the Holden parked further away. He pulled the weighty black bag out of his car, threw it over his shoulder, then locked the wagon and walked towards the shops. After stepping through the centre's automatic glass doors, he made his way towards the food court, 100 metres ahead. Two swaggering men in jeans and tracksuit tops followed him. Farrelly sat down in the middle of the food court in his blue suit with no tie. Surrounding him were mums trying to get their kids to sit still. Suddenly, he reached inside his black bag for a weapon. It wasn't the shotgun that he wanted, but a hunting knife with a 15-centimetre blade and brown wooden handle. It took a while, but the two young guns turned up and sat at a table at one end of the court, then sat back casually. Leaving the black bag on the table, Farrelly walked straight at the crims. He had the knife in his right hand. Its blade rested against the inside of his forearm, making it hard to spot. The young guns became nervous as Farrelly weaved around kids, tables and chairs, heading in their direction. One felt for the revolver tucked in the front of his pants. "G'day, fellas," Farrelly said in an ice-cold tone as he came within striking distance. He cocked his wrist so the blade was exposed and ready to be used. Without breaking stride, Farrelly drove the knife with great force down through the thigh of the young gun sitting closest to him. He was about 3 strides on his way back to his gear when he heard, "Fuck!" Then as he collected his bag, he heard, "Fuck, leave it!" The unharmed young crim had tried to pull the knife out of his mate's leg. The problem was that the blade had not only been driven through the thigh, but into the wooden seat. Someone also handy with a knife or a gun was Wally Kowalka, the uncle of massive Max Kowalka. This deadly grey wolf had been a colonel in the feared secret police of Poland's communist era. During the early 80s, he was a member of the police's 4th Department, which was responsible for the plots against Pope John Paul II. After the fall of communism, the secret police was disbanded. Out of work, Kowalka and his comrades decided to take advantage of Poland's new free market and got rich by buying into state-run businesses cheaply. But towards the end of the 1990s, he was forced out of Poland by more powerful men who craved his slice of the pie. With what funds he had left, Wally and his family migrated to Australia. The Kowalka family house, located in a hilly middle-class neighbourhood, was secured and big. At midnight, Farrelly stood outside the gates of the home. He had his empty black bag over his shoulder and was wondering what he was doing. He was tired and couldn't think clearly. Then Massive Max opened the gates. The big fella smiled, shook Farrelly's hand, mumbled something, then led him up the steps to the front door. When Farrelly entered the Kowalka living room, he thought he'd stepped back in time to a Roman senator's house. Almost everything was white, including pillars, statues and marble floor. Then there was the red velour furniture trimmed in gold. Undisturbed by the stranger's presence, the Kowalkas sat watching a large flat-screen television. The first to get up was little Wally, who was wearing white underpants and singlet, black socks and slippers. With genuine disinterest, he introduced himself to Farrelly. As Farrelly shook hands with the Colonel, he looked over at Sophia Kowalka. Wally's daughter-in-law was sitting on a sofa between 2 plump female relatives. She was trying her best not to acknowledge Farrelly's presence. The next to rise was Peter. He was diminutive and ordinary-looking like his father, and in white underwear and slippers as well. Peter didn't bother to introduce himself, but just gave Farrelly a dismissive nod. Wally then led them all downstairs to the cellar. The air temperature dropped as they walked down the stairs. Farrelly, with Max behind him, slipped a hand onto the shotgun. He wasn't liking this scenario one little bit. He thought to himself that this is where the Kowalkas probably cut up corpses and dispose of them. But everything was cool. Farrelly filled his bag full of the usual in no time and with no trouble. Once he zipped up the black bag, he was ushered back to the front gates where he was to wait for Sophia, who was to make the trip with him to the offices of Stonebridge and Bradley. As he drove toward the CBD with Sophia in the passenger seat, the atmosphere was intense. He'd been thinking about this woman a lot since they'd first met. Now she was sitting right next to him on a drive into town, wearing a pink tracksuit with white piping. As the car sat at traffic lights, Farrelly broke the silence. "I guess you're not happy about being dragged into the city at this time of night, then?" Sophia turned to him and grinned. "You must be joking. Any time away from the Kowalkas is pure heaven." The damn wall that had been holding back the advancement of their relationship now broke, and the two conversed without fear of being judged or betrayed. Sophia told Farrelly that the Kowalkas were horrible people. First there was this Cinderella thing going on between her and her hideous mother and sister-in-law, who were jealous of her. Then there was Peter, her husband, with whom she had no connection whatsoever, and who offered her only a secure existence. He had provided that, but he was very controlling, and the attention Sophia received from other men drove him wild. Farrelly was very aware of this. Earlier, from the open front gates of his home, Peter had watched Sophia and the delivery man leave together. There was also the cautionary tale of the young high-flying lawyer doing the rounds in town. According to gangland rumour, one night a lawyer who worked with Jankowski and the Kowalkas on some property deals was at a party in the penthouse of another prominent narco king. At the party, the young man crowed with hubris about what he was going to do to Sophia when he got her in bed. The lawyer bragged that while he was working with the Polish whore, she never stopped complaining about Peter Kowalka's lack of skill and stamina in the bedroom. The careless young man then went on to tell everyone at the party that he felt it was his duty as a proud Australian to show the hot migrant girl how real men performed in the bedroom. The next day before dawn, as the young man hopped out of his silver Porsche in his driveway, a monster of a man grabbed him by the throat and dragged him out onto the street and to an awaiting car. Soon after, there was a massive manhunt underway for the socialite lawyer, who was known to have underworld connections and disappeared suspiciously. A week later, bushwalkers found the young man dead in a national park. He was naked, minus tongue and genitals, and impaled on a steel stake which had been through his rectum. So Farrelly was quite aware that what was happening between him and Sophia was dangerous, but this knowledge only drove him on. Along with the mother-in-law, the sisters-in-law, and Peter, there was Wally. He was a nasty, sadistic, manipulative man who cared for nothing but business. Sophia explained that Massive Max was the only Kowalka she got along with, even though he was not to be trusted. You would have thought that the last few years with the Kowalkas would have twisted the Polish woman up into a horrible mess, but as she told Farrelly of her tragic, unstable past and current family woes, she smiled and laughed at times, and that made her even more beautiful in the limited light. It was now in the small hours of the morning, so Farrelly parked his Toyota right at the front of the building that housed Stonebridge and Bradley. They entered the building and made their way up to the offices and storeroom, where Sophia switched on the light. Farrelly threw his bag on the table and unloaded the haul. Sophia grabbed her counting machine from the shelf. She was enthralling to watch. As soon as the cash was counted in the machine, it was dispatched into tiny bundles within a flash. Sophia then stacked the bundles and noted down all the numbers on her laptop. Every now and then during the count, she would look up to see Farrelly watching her. She'd smile at him and lose concentration for a second, stalling the counting process and giving them more time together. On the drive back out to the suburbs, neither talked about the Kowalkas or anything else related to their lives in Melbourne. "Oh, I'd love to see Latin America," Sophia declared while Farrelly recounted tales from that part of the world. "You'll have to go there someday and check out those ruined Mayan cities. They're pretty cool." "I wish I had that kind of freedom. I hardly leave the house except for work," she sighed. "Well, you never know what's around the corner, Sophia." The next day, as he drove off from the house of the old Italian bloke, Farrelly knew what was around the corner because he had noticed that a black Toyota twin cab ute was stalking him. Even from a distance, in his rear vision mirror, Farrelly could see the thug he was up against. Piggy Turner, vicious standover man and obese slob, was slumped in the back seat of the black ute. Driving it was a dark-skinned, dark-haired man. Someone similar was sitting next to him in the front passenger seat. Days earlier, Piggy and crew had put one of Jankowski's young guns in the morgue. Using a cement truck, they'd burst through the front security gates of a house that had doubled as a drug lab. Inside the house, a hired gunman, who was supposed to provide security for the lab, opened the bolted steel front door for Turner's crew. Once inside the house, Piggy had a henchman go to town with an iron bar, and he beat all resistance and life out of the young crib running the lab. They ransacked the place, getting hold of a large sum of cash and drugs, and helped themselves to anything else of value. Not one for doing things by halves, Piggy then burnt the house down. Obviously thinking that this didn't say enough, Turner also left a message for Tommy Jankowski, written in blood on the front footpath. Piggy was going to bring the Narco king down, lab by lab, stash house by stash house, shipment by shipment, employee by employee. Farrelly was aware of this and decided there was to be no mucking around this time. This was a time to get him first and kill before being bashed to death or worse. On a main thoroughfare divided by a medium strip, the black ute tailgated the four-wheel drive wagon closely. To put space between him and his foes, Farrelly needed a break in traffic coming from the opposite direction. He put his foot down on the accelerator and sped off for 100 metres. He then threw the wagon over the medium strip. Over the strip, Farrelly flew back up the main road, passing his pursuers. He turned the Toyota left into a tranquil street. 3/4 of the way up the street, Farrelly looked in his rear vision mirror and spotted the black ute. Quickly pulling the grey wagon over to the gutter, Farrelly grabbed 2 smoke grenades from a pouch from under his seat. He opened his door, pulled the pin on the first grenade, and tossed it into the middle of the road. As the grenade popped, spluttered, then started rapidly dispersing green smoke, Farrelly pulled the pin on the second grenade and chucked it a little behind the four-wheel drive. Watching all of this from his front garden across the road was an elderly Greek man. As the driver of the twin cab saw the thick green screen of smoke go up, he slowed the vehicle. Piggy called his driver soft and gave the order to attack, gripping the 9mm pistol in his fat hand tighter. The criminal in the passenger seat broke open his double-barrel sawn-off shotgun to make sure it was loaded. It was. When the twin cab punched through the wall of smoke, the pumped-up, ready-to-go gangsters saw that the wagon was still parked in the same position. The ute pulled up alongside it. Farrelly, however, was nowhere to be found. Piggy and crew looked hard into the vehicle to make sure they hadn't missed anything. The twin cab's driver was out of his seat so he could get a better look into the abandoned vehicle. "Fucking cunt's done a runner," shouted Piggy. As the ute's driver sat back down, he turned to his right quickly. Lead shot from a 12-gauge shotgun shattered the driver's window and took his head off. Brains splattered all over the interior of the twin cab. Before the ejected shotgun cartridge could hit the asphalt, Farrelly had the shotgun pointed at the passenger's chest. The gunman, blinded by blood and brain goo, swung his sawn-off around. Boom! Too slow. Piggy got off 2 rounds. One round went into the door column, the other into the roof. Farrelly pointed the shotgun between the dead driver and the passenger seat to get a clean shot at Turner. As Farrelly aimed, he saw a spent brass cartridge eject from the pistol pointed at him, but in the storm, he was calm. The shotgun recoiled after he pulled its trigger. The following morning, Farrelly turned on the television in his lounge room and sat down on his couch to watch the news. He found all the talk focused on the latest gangland killings. According to the news, it seemed Peter "Piggy" Turner and brothers Ahmed and Mustafa Ali had been lured into a daylight ambush, then taken out by a professional hit squad. Senior police officer Simon Goodbridge, who oversaw the Opus Task Force, the force responsible for stopping the gangland wars, appeared on the TV. Looking and sounding a little rattled by the upsurging murders, Goodbridge stood in front of the taped-off crime scene surrounded by a packed media scrum. The first question the policeman was asked by a journo was the predictable. When will the police put a stop to this underworld war that is out of control? The top cop came back with the usual yarn about gathering evidence and going through correct police procedures and processes. After that, there were a few more of the usual questions, to which the polite policeman answered like a cornered politician. Then one of the more seasoned journalists, who noticed Goodbridge's shaken state, decided to stir things up. The reporter asked the police officer what he thought of a federal politician's suggestion that the only way to stop the war was to spend a lot more money on law enforcement and introduce much stronger sentences and the incarceration of more criminals. The policeman scoffed. What? Another war on crime? Another war on drugs? Haven't we learnt yet that these type of efforts don't work? Instead, I suggest we have an intelligent conversation on what drives the use of illegal substances in this country. Goodbridge assured the public that the police were on top of things and planned to make arrests soon. He then thanked the journalists for coming and walked off. As the press conference ended, Farrelly's phone rang in his pocket. Jankowski was calling. "Bro, just saw the news. We need to talk," Tommy suggested. Before going to see the Narco King, Farrelly dropped off the grey Toyota wagon at a well-known smash repairs place and chop shop run by the notorious Lord family. After he received a lift from the panel beaters, Farrelly marched into the Toyota dealership where he'd picked up the last vehicle. There, he collected a brand new white four-wheel drive wagon. As he pulled out of the dealership, Farrelly figured out the quickest route to Tommy's mansion. He parked around the corner from the mansion and strode toward it. After going through the usual security precautions needed to enter Jankowski's palace, Farrelly walked up the mansion's front stairs and entered the home to find Tommy sitting alone at his dining room table. He had a small sports bag in front of him. "Not sitting out on the balcony today?" Farrelly inquired with a grin. "I took your advice," Tommy replied somberly, then resumed his fingernail chewing. As Farrelly took a seat at the table, Jankowski pushed the small bag towards him. "This is for you." After checking the contents of the bag and finding $250,000 in cash, Farrelly looked at the Narco King strangely. "Piggy Turner, that's the amount I had out on him. You did the job, Jace, so you take it. You earned it." Without saying another word, Farrelly re-zipped the bag. "So how's our other operation going?" Jankowski asked. "Yeah, good." "How long before we can strike?" "A week or two." "Cool. I don't think I can hold off any longer than that," Tommy stressed. Quote from Robert Lindner. "It is a characteristic of all movements and crusades that the psychopathic element rises to the top. The golf course estate, nestling up against the Great Northern Golf Course, was mostly for those pretending to be something they were not. However, the man who lived in the McMansion overlooking the 12th hole and wetlands was what he claimed to be, and that was a violent psychopath. Pedro Hendrickson, son of a violent alcoholic academic father and a Peruvian activist mother, grew up in inner Melbourne. Extremely intelligent, but prone to extreme bouts of violence, Pedro was at constant war with himself due to these two opposing parts of his personality while growing up. In the end, his passion for violence won over, and the best place to fill your boots with brutality is the criminal underworld. There, Pedro's boots overflowed, so much so it led to his incarceration. While in prison during most of his 20s, blonde bespectacled Hendrickson sent more inmates to the hospital and morgue than anyone else in Victorian prison history. He was never charged with any of these crimes. He was a voracious reader and read more books than anyone else in prison history. His favourite topics were law, politics, sociology, criminology, philosophy and military history. Machiavelli, Nietzsche and Hobbes were his favourite thinkers by far. Hendrickson also had a daily physical regime that involved hundreds of push-ups and sit-ups, as well as a couple hours of shadow boxing each day. A lot of solitary confinement turned him into a physical and mental machine. Within hours of his release, he announced to a room full of hardened crims that he was going to revolutionise and dominate the criminal world. Even though the house was full of some of the most feared men in Melbourne, they dared not say anything. There was something unnatural about Henriksen that unnerved them. The stability and calmness he displayed in prison to ensure his release was dropped quickly on the outside. Within a year, through torture, shootings, kidnappings and bombings, Henriksen became one of the dominant narco kings in town. His violent escapades only intensified after he started sampling his own product. Now an ice addict, Pedro was out of control. Body parts and corpses of his associates and enemies were popping up all over town. Anyone and everyone wanted him done. One night, as the sun was setting over the Great Northern Golf Course, Pedro was sitting in his living room with some teenage boys he'd recruited to his cause. With a loaded SKS rifle in his lap, Henriksen was educating the boys on Peruvian revolutionary Tupac Amaru II. The lads looked as if they were listening to their boss as he informed them on the history and struggles of Peru. However, they were too scared to tell Pedro that these subjects that he lectured them on bored them silly. Suddenly, Henriksen paused for a second, realising that he needed some party girls to come and join them. He went outside to the barbecue area to ring up his favourite escorts. When he returned to his living room, the front door was wide open. The only other person in the room was a muscular mountain of a man in a black tracksuit, aiming a .45 caliber pistol at him. With great speed, Henriksen went for the SKS on the couch 3 metres away. The big fella didn't react. Once Pedro had the rifle in his hands, he swung around and pulled the trigger on the weapon as he aimed from the hip at the intruder. Click! The rifle failed to fire. The massive assassin pulled the trigger on his pistol as Henriksen charged at him, his eyes wild. The next day, Simon Goodbridge was standing in front of a mansion and another crime scene, doing another press conference. The police chief gave out some details on the murder, saying that the narco king either knew his killer or the assassin was helped by someone close to him. The reason for this was that the security gate out the front of Henriksen's property was found wide open, and so was the front door. Also, all the CCTV footage had disappeared from the mansion. Then there was the unloaded rifle found in his cold, deceased hand. Cold and deceased was not far from Farrelly's thoughts, although his desires were dominating his fears. Another midnight money run had been ordered, and this filled Farrelly with excitement and apprehension all at the same time. He couldn't wait to be alone with Sophia again, but was dreading entering the Kowalka den. After opening the Kowalka's front gates with a big grin on his face, Max escorted Farrelly up into the house. Farrelly kept his hand resting on the shotgun in his black bag. When they entered the living room, the Kowalkas were in their favourite positions in front of the television. Sophia dared not look in Farrelly's direction. It took some words from Massive Max to get old Wally up from the couch. The Colonel waved a bony hand, indicating for them to follow him down to the cellar. In the basement, as Wally and Max helped him fill the dive bag, Farrelly told himself that this would be the last time he came down there. He was starting to connect the musty, dank smell of the cellar with death. It all went well, however, and Farrelly collected what he had to. He looked all business as he waited by the front gates for Sophia. When she arrived, Sophia acted as if she was doing a chore. But once around the corner in the white four-wheel drive, her demeanour changed quickly. Reclining in the passenger seat, she moaned as Farrelly started talking of travel again. Farrelly parked out the front of Stonebridge and Bradley, and he and Sophia entered the building, then made their way to the storeroom. They did not stop chatting the whole time. Halfway through the money count in the storeroom, Farrelly could hold back his urges no longer. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, just under her breast, and kissed her on the neck. For a split second, Sophia contemplated asking her suitor to stop, but she was soon overwhelmed and turned and sat up on the table among stacked cash, her long legs around Farrelly's waist. "It can be done, you know," he said. "I can do it, trust me." "I don't know. You don't know the Kowalkas like I do. I've faced their kind before. Trust me, I can do this. I can give you the life we talked about." Farrelly spoke again about the carefree, wonderful life they could lead together in a coastal Caribbean town in Costa Rica. The cash tucked away in foreign accounts that Sophia had set up and had access to could keep them afloat for years. All she had to do was say yes. She never did say it though. She didn't have to. Farrelly saw the answer in her big brown eyes. The next morning, Farrelly phoned Tommy Jankowski from the kitchen of his townhouse. "She's good to go." "So she's going to do it?" Tommy asked coolly. "Yeah, all you have to do is organise another midnight run, and Sophia will launder and transfer most of the money. Then I'll take care of the rest." "Fuck, you're good, bro. I'll give you that. You're the best." That night a couple of weeks ago when Farrelly had sat out on the Narco King's terrace, Tommy had asked him what he thought of Sophia. Stupidly, Farrelly had told him that he felt there was some sort of connection between him and the Polish beauty. That's when the shifty Jankowski pounced and told him of his plans to destroy the Kowalkas, who were working in secret to destroy him. Tommy explained that old Wally despised him and was embarrassed at taking orders from and being taxed by a peasant boy. So Wally had devised a series of plots to take Jankowski out and take over his empire. Frankie O'Flynn had been talking peace and amalgamation with Tommy when he was killed. The Kowalkas couldn't afford for Jankowski to align himself with one of the other major players in the industry. Piggy Turner had been paid and promised plenty for his actions against Tommy's organisation, and it ended up costing him his life. Along with Piggy, many others were brought in as either hired hands or were opportunists, keen to feed on the carcass of a vanquished Jankowski. As for Pedro Henriksson, everybody wanted him dead. However, Tommy also had plans. All he needed was someone to snatch Sophia from out of the Kowalkas' claws, as she was the key to their fortune. Sophia had a sharp financial mind and set up all the Kowalkas' offshore accounts and investments. Therefore, if Sophia could be convinced to lift the Kowalkas' fortune away from them clandestinely, without financial backing, they would be nothing and couldn't wage war. This was where Farrelly had come into the story. After Tommy had his hands on the Kowalka fortune, Farrelly was to use Sophia as a bait to enrage Peter and draw him out for the kill. For old Wally and Massive Max, there were other plans that Jankowski did not want to divulge. Quote from Emiliano Zapata: "Better to die on your feet than live on your knees." Here he was once more, sitting in his vehicle outside the house he'd said he would never visit again. Farrelly knew he had more than punched his luck. He'd punched it in the head. His luck was now lying unconscious on the ground. All his experience and instinct was screaming for him to walk away from the whole deal. The question he asked himself as he got out of the white wagon was, is it worth it? Was it worth the value of his word to a narco king to see their deal through to the very end, whatever and whenever that may be? As he stood by the Kowalkas' front gates, perhaps moments away from death or worse, he realised that pocketing a portion of the Kowalka fortune was irrelevant. Massive Max wasn't as cheery as usual when he opened the Kowalkas' front gates. The big fella seemed on edge, constantly clenching his square jaw. Max's disposition set Farrelly's internal workings moving at light speed as he stepped through the double doors of the house. No drug could ever give him this kind of rush. When Farrelly walked into the living room, it was dark and empty except for Peter, who was sitting on the edge of the couch wearing a red and white tracksuit and watching television. As soon as he saw Farrelly and Max enter the room, Peter stood up, revealing he had an Uzi submachine gun in his hand. When Farrelly saw the Uzi, he lined the black bag and the shotgun's muzzle up with little Peter. Farrelly already had his hand on the bag, with a finger on the shotgun's trigger. "I'll be coming with you tonight," Peter stated, with an evil don't fuck with me look on his face. "Fair enough. My father is afraid his money for Thomas will not make it to its destination because of the trouble we have." "Fair enough," Farrelly said, feigning indifference. In the Kowalka's basement, every now and then while Peter was placing bundled bills in the dive bag, he'd look at Farrelly with crazy eyes. Farrelly had no doubt that he and little Peter were headed for a head-on collision. On the drive into town, there was so much tension that it threatened to blow out the vehicle's windows. This wasn't the sexual tension of before, but an atmosphere in which it was clear that one stray look between Sophia in the back seat and Farrelly, who was driving, could push Peter's finger onto the trigger. He was in the front passenger seat. What made it worse was that no one spoke. The only noise was annoying pop music coming from the vehicle's radio. For Farrelly, the reason for doing these midnight cash runs was to get Sophia into the offices of Stonebridge and Bradley by herself. The dodgy businessman running the company kept constant watch over Sophia out of fear of the Kowalkers. He allowed her little leeway, making it impossible to launder and move funds electronically to where Farrelly wanted them during business hours. Having Peter tag along on this trip had sent his plans into chaos. After they had arrived at the building in which Stonebridge and Bradley was housed and made their way to the storeroom, the usual cash counting process took place. Farrelly played it cool as he sat in the storeroom corner, pretending to stay awake as Sophia counted cash. Her agitated husband watched on with the Uzi in his hand. Halfway through the count, Farrelly pulled his phone out of the pants pocket of his favourite light grey suit. "Who are you calling?" little Peter asked aggressively. "A mate, is that all right?" "No phone calls," ordered Peter, placing his free hand on the Uzi as if he was about to use it. "Relax, Tiger." Carefully, Farrelly placed the phone back in his pocket. The count had just finished, and Farrelly was about to do his usual thing of waiting downstairs while Sophia secured the money and officers. But as he exited the offices, heading towards the lift, Peter called him back and told him to wait in reception. As he sat in the waiting room, his cashless black bag by his feet, Farrelly contemplated taking on little Peter right there and then, as he thought the situation was heading downhill in a hurry. After Peter and his wife had a quiet conversation in Polish in an office, they walked back up the corridor to reception. "Are we good to go?" Little Peter answered Farrelly's question with a glare that would give Hitler a scare. He pointed towards the lift with the submachine gun's muzzle. All three took the elevator down to the ground floor in silence. As he stepped out of the lift on the ground floor first, Farrelly adjusted the bag which was slung over his shoulder and walked towards the front door. Sophia and Peter brought up the rear. As Farrelly pushed open the front door, someone stepped in from his left and placed a pistol barrel against his temple. He put his hands up immediately. "Fucking told you, you idiot," Farrelly murmured to himself in disappointment. Inside the building's small foyer, Max patted Farrelly down and confiscated his pistol, palm knife, hunting knife, extendable baton, and the shotgun in the dive bag. Everybody jumped into the white wagon parked out the front. Max drove. Farrelly was in the front passenger seat, and Peter was behind him with the Uzi. Sophia sat next to her husband, shaking. Not a word was spoken as the car cruised out of the deserted CBD. However, there were plenty of thoughts ricocheting around in Farrelly's skull, some of which were fanciful. Maybe they'll just drop me off somewhere and let me go my own way. That was nonsense, and he knew it. Fuck it, I'll grab the steering wheel and crash the car. That was no good. He'd probably get killed in the accident. Fuck! That's better than having my nuts cut out and a steel stake up my arse. He relaxed a touch and decided to let things play out as he saw Max get on the Essendon freeway and head northwest. As they drove by Essendon Airport on their right, Farrelly considered looking around to see Sophia, maybe for the last time. But he decided against this, as it would cost him a burst in the back from the Uzi. Minutes later, the brightly lit up Tullamarine International Airport appeared on the horizon. Maybe we're going to the airport, Farrelly wondered. Massive Max pushed the four-wheel drive wagon right on by the turn-off for the airport, but not for long. After turning off the freeway, they were in open country on a sealed road heading north. The lay of the land in the area which they were now travelling was flat, except for a little undulation. Suddenly, the headlights of the Toyota dipped down and the vehicle was tasked with hugging a patchy road that wound and twisted in and out of steep valleys and gullies. Farrelly could feel Peter getting anxious behind him. "Should be around the next bend, Max." The sound of little Peter's voice gave everybody in the car a bit of a fright. Until now, everything had been deathly silent. Around the next bend and down into the valley below was a good-sized bridge. The structure was supported by concrete piers and stretched out over a fair-sized creek. "Pull over here," ordered Peter as they crossed the bridge. His command was heard and obeyed. Max pulled the wagon over and parked in some gravel to the left of the bridge and 30 metres up. When Massive Max turned off the engine and lights, it was silent and dark under a half-moon covered in a cloud. Farrelly was scared, but the presence of this emotion was a good sign. "Get out!" Little Peter's rancid breath brushed by Farrelly's cheek as he gave his instruction to the condemned man in the front seat. At this point, Farrelly had forgotten Sophia even existed. Saying goodbye never entered his mind. He was too busy mulling over 100 different scenarios as he opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel. "This way," Peter instructed as he pointed the Uzi over the road. Farrelly stood his ground. Little Peter took 2 steps towards his captive and poked him in the shoulder with his weapon, then said in a low growl, "I can shoot you right here if you want. Then I'll have Max carry your body over to the creek and throw it in. Your choice." Farrelly's heart was pounding like a big band drum, not just because of how close he was to death, but from anger and frustration as well. The presence of these emotions was an excellent development. As he walked over asphalt with Max in front of him and Peter behind him, Farrelly cleared his mind of any negative thoughts and prepared for the oncoming collision. In the dark, as he stepped down the steep embankment beside the road, he noticed the creek was covered by trees and thick scrub. He even got a fair idea how steep and deep its banks were. All 3 men tramped over thick wet grass then stopped. The creek was metres ahead of them, and the bridge the same distance behind and to the right. "Stop! Get on your knees and put your hands on your head," Little Peter told the captive. "Nah, fuck it, I'm standing. Max, finish him!" With the pistol in his right hand, Max turned around and took 2 steps forward. He stopped when Farrelly spoke up. "What, you don't have the balls to do the job yourself? Sophia said you were a soft cock, Peter. You're a fucking little pussy." Suddenly out of the silence came 2 sounds. One was a guttural growl from Little Peter, who had just had his ego slapped. The other was that of an approaching car. Peter Kowalka marched over to his cousin, handed him the Uzi, and snatched the pistol out of Max's hand. Unhinged by anger, Peter approached and stood behind his antagonist. Farrelly dug his heels into the ground and bent a little at the knees, making sure he had a steady base. He was waiting for the feel of steel against the back of his head. Then he felt it. Just as a pistol muzzle was pressed against the base of Farrelly's skull, headlights from the approaching vehicle lit up the flat area beside the bridge. The Kowalkas looked to their left and stared into the car's lights. As Peter turned away from the mesmerising beams, he felt severe pain in his right wrist. Farrelly held Little Peter in a tight wrist lock, reversing the handgun so that it was now pointing back at him. Peter panicked when the light showed him the weapon in his hand was aimed at his upper body. The pistol fired twice. Max froze. After the vehicle had passed and plunged the world back into darkness, Farrelly threw a downward left elbow with all his weight behind it. Hitting the temple, Peter collapsed unconscious. In the confusion, Farrelly lost sight and sense of the pistol, so he sprinted for the creek. An ear-splitting 4-round burst from the Uzi chased him down the steep ravine. Farrelly slid, rolled, and got slashed and bashed all the way down to the bottom of the creek bed, destroying his good suit in the process. But he couldn't care less about his suit. He was alive, pissed off, and already thinking revenge. As another burst from the submachine gun raked the bushes just above Farrelly's head, he got on his stomach behind some rocks in the dry creek bed. There were 2 more eruptions from the Uzi, but those rounds pierced nothing but brush and earth. The next lot of screams that shattered country silence were not from an internal combustion engine or an automatic weapon. They were from a human being in unadulterated agony. Massive Max wasn't coming down the bank of the ravine to kill anyone, and neither was Peter. He'd taken 2 rounds to the sternum. While cries of pain rang out in the valley, Farrelly was moving with pace towards the bridge along the creek bed, which was littered with car parts and debris. Knowing that his cousin needed medical attention, Max went to pick Peter up by the arms, producing a series of screams that made your hair stand on end. As he stood frozen over his writhing cousin, he forgot all about the man he had tried to kill seconds before. That same man had already scrambled up the bare bank under the bridge and was making his way towards the Toyota four-wheel drive. 20 metres away from the vehicle, Farrelly squatted in some wet, knee-high grass. As he did, he could hear cries moving closer from the other side of the road. Because of the pain, Peter didn't want to be moved, so Max was forced to drag him by the arms. But every few metres, the profusely bleeding Peter would beg his cousin to stop. Max would then have to start all over again when Peter had settled. At the bottom of the embankment, the pain became too much for little Peter and he fell unconscious. Taking advantage of this, Max scooped up his cousin and stomped up the embankment, then made his way to the wagon. Once he was at the Toyota, Max opened the back door with one hand while holding Peter with the other arm. "Move over," the big fella told Sophia, who a split second before had her hands over her ears and her eyes closed tightly. "What happened?" asked a shocked Sophia as she shuffled along the back seat. As Max laid Peter down with care in the back seat, Sophia stared at her husband, who was pale and bloody. Then the big bloke asked Sophia if the captive had been back to the car. "No. Is he dead?" Massive Max removed his bulky body from out of the back seat and stood up straight. He blinked, not believing his eyes. To his left, standing at the back of the vehicle, Farrelly was silhouetted, and he had a shotgun pointed straight at him. Boom! Large lead shot shredded off half of Max's head. He spun around in the opposite direction as Farrelly fired again. Massive Max crashed into the asphalt with a thud. Happy that Max was no longer a threat, Farrelly popped the back hatch of the wagon. He struggled to drag Max's carcass off the road. It took all of his upper and lower body strength to get the headless hulk into the back compartment of the vehicle. When he got the hatch shut, Farrelly had to take some deep breaths to compose himself. Dawn was fast approaching, and he was nowhere finished yet. "Is he awake?" Farrelly inquired as he jumped into the driver's seat of the wagon. From the front passenger seat, Sophia looked around into the back seat where Peter lay. "No, I think he's dead." "Fuck, that's no good. We need him." "For what? What are you doing?" Sophia asked, shell-shocked, as Farrelly threw the car into a right U-turn to drive back over the bridge. "Going back to the Kowalkas." "Are you crazy?" "Nah, just on a roll." Every now and then on the drive back to his home, little Peter would moan, lift his head, mumble something in Polish, then pass out. 10 minutes away from the Kowalka Palace, Farrelly told Sophia to grab her husband's mobile phone out of his pocket and ring Wally. She stared at Farrelly and said, "I hope you know what you're doing." "She'll be right," Farrelly assured Sophia. He took one hand off the steering wheel, grabbed her hand and squeezed it. He instructed her what to say to the old wolf over the phone. Wally was in bed asleep when his mobile phone rang. When his daughter-in-law told him of the murderous ambush that had been sprung and the condition his son was in, he jumped straight out of bed. When they stopped at a set of traffic lights 2 blocks from the Kowalka mansion, Farrelly had Sophia ring again, this time to tell the Colonel to have the gates and garage open so they could drive right in. 50 metres from the Kowalka street, Farrelly pulled the four-wheel drive over. While they were parked, he made sure everything was ready to go for what was about to happen next. Now in the driver's seat, Sophia made the invisible sign of the cross over her head and chest with her hand. Then she said some prayers and drove off. Just as she had requested, the front security gates had been rolled back. Sophia drove the white wagon through the gates, down the sloped driveway and into the double garage under the house, where Wally was waiting with the lights on. As soon as the car came to a halt, the Colonel was right there at the back door, passenger side. Old Wally, in white jocks and singlet, opened the back door and stood there staring at his son, who was moaning and bleeding to death slowly. "My God, what has happened to my boy?" he cried out. As he finished his sentence, Farrelly bobbed up from behind the back seat with his pistol in his hand. "He ran out of luck, just like you," he said. As those words sunk in, Wally reached for the revolver tucked into the front of his underwear. Crack, crack! The Colonel fell flat on his back. His revolver slipped out of his underwear and skated across the concrete floor. As Wally Kowalka was sucking in his last breaths, Jason Farrelly stood over him with a pistol pointed at his head. The old man tilted his head up and looked straight through his killer. Farrelly pulled the trigger on the handgun twice. Then he dragged Wally's body by the legs around the back of the Toyota, leaving a nasty blood trail in his wake. He picked up the limp, light corpse and threw it on top of Max's cadaver in the wagon's rear compartment. Just as Farrelly was about to rip Peter out of the back seat, Mrs. Kowalka and her daughters entered the garage from the stairs that led down from the house. Mrs. Kowalka was armed with an AK-47. From the front of the four-wheel drive, Sophia fired 2 rounds from a .45 caliber pistol. 1 round struck Mrs. Kowalka in the throat. The old woman dropped the AK, grabbed her neck with both hands and squealed. Sophia's next 2 shots dropped her mother-in-law. The sisters ran back upstairs, terror-stricken. Farrelly jumped into the passenger's seat of the wagon and closed the door as Sophia reversed the vehicle out of the garage. She backed the vehicle out of the driveway onto the street and sped off at great speed. 2 days later, Farrelly went to press the intercom button beside the gate at Jankowski's Bayside mansion. He was in a relaxed mood, even though he knew very well he was under surveillance by either opposition drug cartels or the authorities. He passed by the tattooed tough guy inside the gate and wandered up the wide steps of the Narco palace. Before going through the glass front doors, he stopped for a minute and turned around to take in the view of the bay. Content, he entered the mansion and walked through the open front living space and into the dining room area toward the back of the home. There, the Narco King was seated at his dining room table. "Still not using your balcony, I see," Farrelly joked as he entered the dining area. Ignoring the attempt at humour, Jankowski lowered the phone he had in his hands and asked, "Fucking hell, what happened? Everyone is going apeshit looking for the Kowalkas." "Really?" Farrelly replied as he sat down at one end of the table. "Yeah, really." Tommy held out his phone in one hand and showed Farrelly the news headline that screamed for justice and the Narco King's arrest. Shaking his head, Jankowski asked his old pal what had happened to his treacherous employees and, more importantly, where their money was. After Jankowski's questions, Farrelly thought back to when he'd left the Kowalka's house almost a week ago with a car full of dead Polish gangsters. He had dropped Sophia off at a railway station car park where she could get a cab back into town. From there, she had gone back to the offices of Stonebridge and Bradley and electronically moved most of the Kowalka's fortune into accounts that only she could access. From there, Sophia went to Tullamarine Airport by taxi and boarded an international flight. After dropping off Sophia, Farrelly had got straight on his mobile phone and called a farmer he'd known since he was a kid and told him he was on his way. Hours later, the Toyota wagon arrived at the farmer's property out near the snowy mountains. Having been warned, the farmer had used his front-end loader to dig a pit in a back paddock that was large enough for the wagon. Farrelly drove right on into the hole. Minutes later, the Kowalkas were buried in a tomb that'll never be disturbed. Farrelly didn't tell Jankowski any of this as he sat at the dining room table. All he said was, "Can't tell you what happened, Tommy. All you need to know is that the job is done. As for your money, your share is on its way." "Cool, bro." A couple of seconds later, the Narco King sparked up again. "Hey, listen to this idea." Jankowski spoke at length of the new illegal enterprise he had in mind and said he was keen for Farrelly to be part of it. "I don't think so, mate." "What? Come on, bro, we're a team now." "Nah, you don't understand, I'm done." Farrelly explained that he didn't like the sort of heat that was coming down on him at the minute and said that he planned on laying low for a while. "And I tell you what, Tommy," he added, "you should go on holidays as well, because the way you're going, you're either going to end up in prison or in a cemetery, most likely in the cemetery." Farrelly pushed his chair out from under the table, got up and walked towards the front door. Jankowski sat staring into space, chewing his fingernails and bouncing his knee up and down at great speed. As he opened the mansion's front doors and got a face full of fresh sea air, Farrelly heard Tommy yell out, "Don't worry about me, bro. No one can touch me. I run this state. I'm fucking invincible. Do you hear me? Fucking invincible." End of chapter 3.